It was a typical Friday evening at La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The gentle hum of conversation filled the air, accompanied by the clinking of fine glassware and the soft melodies of jazz drifting from the corner where a grand piano sat. Waitstaff dressed in polished uniforms moved through the room with practiced grace, ensuring that every guest felt pampered and attended to. Among them was Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress who had spent countless evenings in this refined setting, balancing plates and pouring wine with a friendly smile. Though to most of the patrons, Deborah was just another face in the crowd. Her eyes revealed a different story. Beneath the polite exterior was a young woman with dreams far bigger than the confines of La Fontaine. Music was her true passion, though it had been sidelined by the demands of life. The piano that stood in the corner of the restaurant had become her silent companion, a reminder of the dreams she had set aside. During rare breaks, she would steal a few moments to sit at the old dusty piano in the back room, letting her fingers glide over the keys as the music soothed her. She had grown up in a small town in South Carolina where opportunities for artistic pursuits were scarce. Deborah's mother, a tireless nurse, had always done her best to provide for the family, often working double shifts just to keep a roof over their heads. Music had been a constant in their home, though it was more of an escape than a career path. Her mother's old vinyl records and a second-hand piano had nurtured her love for melody, and as a child, Deborah had poured hours into learning to play. But as the years passed, the reality of finances and responsibility crept in, and her dreams of a music career were pushed further into the background. Now, working at La Fontaine was a means to an end. It wasn't where she wanted to be forever, but it was a stepping stone to something more. Yet, as she went about her shift that night, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that her true potential was still waiting to be unlocked. The elegance of the restaurant and the sophistication of its patrons felt like a world away from the young girl who once played her heart out on an old, out-of-tune piano. Little did she know, tonight would be the night when everything would change. It was just another typical night at La Fontaine when he walked in. The restaurant's dimly lit ambiance, designed to evoke a sense of sophistication, seemed to deepen in his presence. Leonard Grayson wasn't just another patron, he was a force, an embodiment of wealth and privilege that instantly commanded attention. With his tailored suit, sharp jawline, and polished shoes, he moved through the room like he owned it, like the air itself bent to his will. He was one of those men whose every word seemed to carry weight, and his laugh, boisterous and loud, pierced the air like a subtle challenge to everyone around him. Deborah, going about her duties as usual, barely noticed the group as they entered. However, something about Leonard made her pause. He had an aura that was hard to ignore. Perhaps it was the way his gaze swept across the room, quickly sizing up the atmosphere and the people within it. Or maybe it was the sense of superiority that oozed from every move he made. Whatever it was, it didn't go unnoticed by Deborah, who had learned over the years to observe quietly and keep her distance from the type of person who felt entitled to dominate any space they entered. She tried not to let it affect her as she moved toward their table to take their order. She had dealt with difficult customers before, people who wanted to be entertained or people who thought their money gave them the right to disrespect those serving them. But Leonard Grayson was different. There was something colder, more calculated in the way he interacted with others. His sharp eyes seemed to dissect everything and everyone in his vicinity, including Deborah. When he finally glanced up at her, his gaze lingered a bit longer than necessary. It was an assessing look, one that made her skin prickle, as if he could see right through her. "Deborah, huh?" he said, his voice cutting through the soft background noise. "Sounds like someone with hidden talents." His words hit Deborah like a flicker of light on a darkened stage. She didn't quite understand what he meant at first, but the implication was clear. It was the kind of comment that made her feel small, insignificant, as though he was already categorizing her as something to be dismissed. There was an almost predatory air about him. His eyes scanned her face for a reaction, as if savoring the idea of getting under her skin. Deborah, ever the professional, didn't let her discomfort show. She offered a polite smile and continued taking the orders of his companions. She had learned long ago not to engage with people like Leonard. There was no use in reacting to people who had no interest in seeing you as anything more than a tool for their entertainment. But Leonard wasn't finished. As she stepped away to fetch their drinks, she could feel his eyes following her. She tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. He was just another arrogant customer, she reminded herself. But his presence lingered in the room, thickening the air around her, making her doubt herself for reasons she couldn't fully understand. She had grown up learning to deal with people who didn't see her as worthy, whether it was because of her small-town roots or her job as a waitress, but there was something about Leonard that made the old wounds feel fresh again. Still, she kept her composure. This was her job, after all. The last thing she needed was to get rattled by a man like him. As she approached the table again, Leonard's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Tell me, Deborah," he asked, eyes narrowing with mock curiosity. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely someone like you has bigger dreams." Deborah's fingers trembled for a brief moment as she set the wine glass on the table. His tone wasn't inquisitive. It was dismissive, as if he expected her to be nothing more than the sum of her job. His words stung more than they should have, and she struggled to hold on to her composure. But Deborah was no stranger to condescension. People had tried to belittle her before, and she had always risen above it. She could do so again, couldn't she? "I play piano sometimes," she said quietly, hoping the conversation would end there. Leonard's smirk widened as if her simple answer intrigued him. His eyes gleamed with something close to amusement. "A pianist, huh?" he said slowly as though savoring the word. "How fascinating. Why don't you play for us? Show us what you've got." His challenge was deliberate, a calculated move to embarrass her in front of everyone. It wasn't about appreciating her talent. It was about forcing her to perform for his amusement, to prove that her talents were less valuable than his wealth and status. And for a moment, Deborah almost walked away, but she couldn't. There was something about the way he spoke, the condescension wrapped in his every word, that demanded a response. Deborah's pulse quickened. She wasn't just facing a wealthy businessman. She was facing a man who represented everything she had worked so hard to escape, everything she had always been told she was too small to achieve, and the challenge hung in the air, mocking her quiet ambition. But little did Leonard know, this moment would set the stage for something Deborah had never imagined. The room seemed to quiet just a little as Deborah turned away from Leonard's table, still processing the words he'd thrown at her. But as she moved to serve another table, the weight of his challenge hung in the air like an unspoken dare. She could feel his gaze following her, his eyes sharp and calculating, waiting for her to break under the pressure. It wasn't just about the piano now. It was about proving something to him, showing him that she wasn't some object to be humiliated. But the thought of performing in front of a crowd, especially one that had already been poisoned by Leonard's mocking tone, made her stomach twist. She had seen it before, the way people like Leonard got their kicks out of making others squirm. He wasn't just rich, he was used to getting what he wanted, no matter who had to pay the price. His words had cut deeper than she had expected. Deborah knew she wasn't a professional musician, but music was her soul. It was the one thing that had always belonged to her, the one thing she had never let anyone take away. The piano at La Fontaine wasn't just a piece of furniture in the corner, it was a sanctuary. It had seen her joy, her struggles, and her silent dreams. To play in front of an audience, especially one as hostile as this, was terrifying. Her fingers tingled with the urge to play, to prove Leonard wrong, to show him that her talent wasn't some circus act he could call upon for his amusement. But fear crept in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the crowd wasn't impressed? What if Leonard's smirk only deepened with her failure? As she moved between tables, the nervous energy within her grew. Her shift had taken on a strange sense of urgency, as if the evening had become a countdown to something inevitable. She noticed a few of the other waitstaff glancing over at her, their eyes filled with sympathy or maybe curiosity, but no one dared to say anything. Leonard's challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud, and the tension was palpable, the usual background noise of the restaurant. The clinking of silverware, the soft murmurs of conversation, felt muted, as though it had all been replaced by a singular question. Would she accept? By the time she returned to Leonard's table with the bottle of wine, she felt as though her every step was under the microscope. She kept her eyes focused on the task at hand, trying to ignore the way her hands were shaking ever so slightly as she poured the wine. The air felt thick, and Deborah's chest tightened. Leonard leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He made no effort to hide the amusement on his face. "Well, Deborah," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room, "I hope you weren't just all talk. That piano won't play itself." He was goading her now, pushing her, testing her. There was a malicious glee in his voice as he continued. "Come on, don't let the crowd down. Show us what you've got." Her heart raced and a million thoughts swirled in her head. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, all waiting for her to either rise to the challenge or back down. She had never been the type to crave attention, but in that moment, she realized she couldn't let this moment pass. She couldn't let Leonard, or anyone, define her worth. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She wasn't going to play for Leonard. She wasn't going to perform to appease his ego. She was going to play for herself. This wasn't about him. This was about taking back control, about reminding herself that her dreams, her talent, weren't things to be ridiculed or diminished. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but soft. The words had barely left her mouth before the room seemed to hold its breath. The challenge had been accepted, and as Deborah turned toward the grand piano in the corner, a shift took place. This wasn't going to be just another performance. This was a moment of reckoning, for her and for Leonard. She could feel the weight of the room's eyes on her, but it didn't matter anymore. She was about to show them all exactly who she was. Deborah's steps toward the piano felt heavier than usual, as though each movement carried the weight of her own fears. The gleaming white keys seemed to mock her as she approached the grand piano in the corner, a silent reminder of everything she had hoped to become. The chandelier above cast a spotlight on the instrument, isolating her from the rest of the room. For a brief moment it felt as though the entire restaurant had gone quiet, the atmosphere thick with expectation. Leonard's voice still lingered in her mind, but now it was distant, as if coming from another world entirely. She sat down at the piano, her fingers brushing against the cool, polished keys. The nerves that had gripped her at first began to melt away, replaced by something else. A quiet strength, a kind of determination that she hadn't felt in years settled over her. Deborah had spent so many nights practicing in the solitude of her small apartment, pouring every ounce of herself into her music. But this was different. This wasn't a cozy living room filled with the sound of her own thoughts. This was a room full of strangers, some of whom had already decided what she was worth. She took a deep breath, blocking out the noise in her head, and placed her hands firmly on the keys. At first, her touch was tentative, careful, almost fragile. But as the first notes of the song began to fill the air, she felt something shift. It was as though she was no longer playing for the people in the room. Not for Leonard, not even for the applause. She was playing for herself, for the dreams she had buried for so long, for the child who used to lose herself in the music when nothing else made sense. The melody of Clair de Lune swirled through the space, delicate and haunting. Deborah's fingers began to glide over the keys with a fluidity she hadn't expected. The tension in her shoulders relaxed as the music took over, each note echoing the emotions she had locked away for years. The grief of unfulfilled dreams, the pride of self-made progress, and the quiet, unwavering hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she'd once believed. Around her, the room began to change. The diners who had been whispering and laughing at Leonard's table fell silent. The energy in the room shifted, like a breeze had blown through and swept away the arrogance that had filled the air just moments ago. Even Leonard, who had been so certain of his dominance, leaned forward, his face unreadable. His earlier smugness had faded, replaced by something unfamiliar, perhaps a flicker of respect, or maybe just the realization that he had underestimated her. Deborah let the music speak for itself. The delicate notes of Clair de Lune were no longer just an elegant piece of classical music. They had become her declaration. Every chord was a defiance against the years of self-doubt. Every rise and fall of the melody was a step closer to the woman she had always known she could be. And as the final haunting notes filled the air, the room was still. There was no applause yet, no rush to speak. It was as if the entire space was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Deborah sat still for a long moment, her fingers lingering on the keys, unsure of what she had just done, but knowing it had changed something. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive. It was a silence of awe, of recognition. Slowly, the room exhaled, the tension breaking as the first applause broke through the stillness. For the first time in a long while, Deborah allowed herself to smile. This wasn't about proving anything to Leonard, or to anyone else. It was about reclaiming something that had always been hers. Her talent, her voice, her identity. The music had done what words never could. Reminded her that she was worthy of more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. As the last note of Clair de Lune hung in the air, Deborah sat motionless at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. For a brief moment, the world around her seemed to disappear. The weight of the restaurant, of Leonard's challenge, of the expectant eyes watching her, all of it vanished. It was as if the music had transported her to a place where she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. A place where her talent stood for itself. But reality soon crept back in as the silence stretched just a bit too long. The room remained still. No one moved, no one spoke. Deborah held her breath, afraid that if she exhaled, the magic of the moment would shatter. Then, slowly, one by one, the diners began to clap. At first it was hesitant, unsure, a polite, almost apologetic applause. But then, as the recognition of what had just happened spread, the applause grew louder, more heartfelt. Deborah could feel her heart swell with each clap, each cheer, but she didn't rise. She stayed seated, letting the sound of their admiration wash over her. From the corner of her eye, she saw Leonard. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by something different, something Deborah couldn't quite place. He was clapping too, but it was slow, forced, as if he wasn't sure how to respond. His applause felt empty, like a hollow gesture meant to save face rather than to genuinely acknowledge her talent. The more Deborah looked at him, the clearer it became. His bravado had cracked, just like the silence that followed her performance. It was a shift he hadn't been prepared for. For the first time, the power dynamic in the room had changed. Leonard, the wealthy entrepreneur who often commanded attention with a simple glance, had been rendered speechless by the force of her music. Deborah wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an artist, and everyone in that room, every person who had watched her perform, knew it. Even the staff who had been quietly observing from the sidelines joined in the applause. They had seen Deborah practice on the old, worn piano during her breaks. They had known her quiet passion, but this was different. Deborah stood slowly, her knees shaking, but her back straight. She gave a small, polite nod to the room, acknowledging the applause, but she didn't look at Leonard right away. The way he sat there, almost frozen in his chair, made her realize something important. He might have had wealth, influence, and power, but those things hadn't been enough to diminish the one thing she'd always had, the purity of her craft. The applause finally began to taper off, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. There was a new respect in the air, one that didn't come from money or status, but from genuine admiration. Leonard's entourage, once laughing at her expense, now looked awkward, unsure of how to continue their conversation. The arrogance that had once filled their corner of the room had evaporated, leaving only an uncomfortable silence in its place. Deborah, however, felt something different. She felt lighter. The heavy weight of self-doubt that had lingered in her chest was gone. She wasn't the girl she had been when she walked into La Fontaine that evening. She wasn't just a waitress with a dream. She had shown them all who she really was. And though Leonard's slow, reluctant clapping didn't carry the same warmth as the rest of the room, it didn't matter anymore. The power had shifted. No amount of money or arrogance could take away the respect she had earned in that moment. With a steady breath, she turned and walked away from the piano, her head held high. Leonard's table, once the center of attention, had quieted. His usual confidence had faltered, replaced by a subtle discomfort. As Deborah passed by, one of his companions, a younger man with a gentler demeanor, caught her eye. He smiled and gave her a slight nod, offering a simple, sincere, "You were incredible." Deborah offered him a small, genuine smile in return. She didn't need to hear more. The applause had already spoken for her. She had already proven something far more important than any public recognition. She had reminded herself that her dreams were worth fighting for. She wasn't just a waitress with hidden potential. She was an artist, and for the first time in a long while, she believed it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, with Leonard and his entourage quickly retreating from the spotlight they had once dominated. They were quieter now, their conversations more subdued, their usual bravado gone. It was as though the energy in the room had shifted entirely. What had once been an air of superiority now felt more like discomfort. Deborah noticed the change, but she wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Her mind was on the music, on the feeling of finally being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. As she walked through the dining room, refilling drinks and clearing plates, patrons approached her with compliments. "You were incredible," an older woman said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so beautiful." Deborah smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. She had always dreamed of moments like this, when her music could touch others, when it could transcend the limitations of her job and speak directly to their hearts. It was something she had never imagined would happen in a place like La Fontaine, in front of people who saw her as just another waitress. But tonight, the music had proven otherwise. Later, when she passed Leonard's table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with an expression that was a mixture of annoyance and reluctant respect. He muttered something under his breath, trying to regain his composure, but it was too late. His mask had slipped. He had been exposed for what he truly was, someone who sought power through humiliation, someone who underestimated the strength of a quiet woman with a passion for her craft. "You made your point," Leonard said, his tone stiff. "I suppose you really do have talent." Deborah nodded, her expression calm but firm. She wasn't angry, nor did she feel the need to rub her victory in his face. His words were hollow, meant to save face rather than acknowledge the truth. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady. She didn't need to say more. It was as if the whole room was exhaling in unison, the air lighter, the weight of judgment gone. Her colleagues, who had stood quietly on the sidelines, now gave her quiet nods and smiles. Their faces, once filled with sympathy, were now filled with admiration. They had seen her take on the challenge, and they had seen her rise above it. The night ended, but for Deborah, something had changed. The tips that night were generous, enough to cover her rent and even put a little aside for her piano lessons, something she had been putting off for years. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the feeling that, for the first time, she was truly moving forward, towards something greater than she had ever imagined. Her dreams no longer seemed distant, no longer felt unreachable. Days later, Deborah received a phone call from a man who had been dining at La Fontaine that evening. He introduced himself as a music producer from Nashville, and though he wasn't offering fame or fortune, he was offering something far more significant, a chance to record a demo. The offer was small, perhaps, but it felt like a door opening, a first step towards something she had only ever dreamed of. As she walked home that evening, her thoughts didn't linger on the moment with Leonard or the uncomfortable tension of that night. Instead, they were on the future, on the possibility that had been offered to her, the path that had now unfolded before her. Deborah had always known that her talent was something worth fighting for, but now she truly believed it. The doubt, the fear, the uncertainty, she had let those things go. She sat at her worn piano in her apartment, her fingers brushing the keys gently. The sound wasn't as rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music was hers. It always had been. And now, As she closed her eyes and played, she could hear the echoes of something more, a future that was finally within reach. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an artist. And this was only the beginning. Deborah's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of staying true to who you are, regardless of the challenges or obstacles that might come your way. In a world where social status, wealth, and superficial appearances often dominate, it's easy to get caught up in the expectations and opinions of others. People like Leonard Grayson, who use their power to belittle and humiliate others, are a common presence in today's society. They thrive on making others feel small to elevate themselves. But Deborah's journey teaches us that true power comes from within. It's not about proving your worth to those who seek to put you down. It's about recognizing your own value and using your talents, not to appease others, but to honor yourself. By staying authentic to her passion for music, Deborah silenced the voices of doubt, both external and internal, and reclaimed her sense of self. Her performance wasn't just a moment of artistic expression, it was an act of reclaiming control over her narrative. It wasn't Leonard's mockery that defined her, but her own response to it. In today's world, we often see people like Leonard who use their wealth, influence, or status to belittle others. Whether it's in the workplace, in social circles, or even through social media, the temptation to seek validation by putting others down is real. It's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to fit in or measure up to someone else's idea of success. But the lesson here is clear. Don't let others define your worth. In our society, it's critical to remember that we are more than just our job titles, our bank accounts, or the opinions others have of us. Don't let anyone, whether it's a boss, a peer, or a person with more power, diminish your self-worth. Like Deborah, find the courage to stand firm in who you are and what you believe in. Your true value is not something that can be shaken by another's arrogance. Take inspiration from her resilience and use your own gifts to rise above negativity. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone tries to belittle you, remember this. Your talent, your dreams, and your authenticity are powerful. Don't let the fear of rejection or mockery stop you from shining. Instead of trying to fit into someone else's narrative, create your own story. The world needs more of your authentic self, not the version shaped by the judgment or ridicule of others. Be like Deborah. Stay true, stay strong, and never let someone else's insecurity make you doubt your worth.